Well, welcome back today, and today we're going to be taking a look at back to Jude 3, the idea of the faith. Uh, the Holy Spirit is compelling Jude to write to you and me about how to, and that we should contend for the faith. What happens in our understanding, what happens in our spiritual development, is that we kind of lock on to faith is somehow this esoteric thing that, okay, it's just what you believe. And we talked about this just briefly in episode 2. It's an argument that apparently they had early on in the early church. What matters? Does our actions matter? Does our faith matter? How do these things go together? Here's the illustration that James picks up. This is chapter 2, verse 14. It says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them?" So suppose that a brother or sister is without clothes or daily food, and if one of you says to them, "Well, go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith, just belief, by itself, if it's not accompanied by actions, is dead. Verse 18, we're going to start getting now into the heart of this today. But someone will say, "Well, you have faith, and I have deeds." And James counters this with a very important understanding that show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. So let's pause here for just a moment and really try to consider this thing called faith and the faith. See, because there's a difference. If we just eliminate faith down to a belief system, okay, well, I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, is that enough to really do something? We talked in the very first episode about what I believe the faith is, and here's how James says it in this. So, do you want to believe that there's one God? He said, good. Even the demons believe that, and they shudder. But he says, "You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless?" And he comes in and James pulls out of the Old Testament this strange thing where God told Abraham to take his son Isaac up onto a mountain and sacrifice him. In verse 21, James chapter 2, it says, was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar?" You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and that his faith was made complete by what he did. Genesis 15, verses 5 and 6, that Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Believe it or not, this thing that happens when Abram in chapter 15 is trying to figure out who's going to get my stuff when I die, is it Eliezer or Damascus? What happens here is that God prophesies to Abram this idea that his generations, his people will be like that of the sands on the seashore, the stars in the sky. And so in James chapter 2, verse 23, it says that Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. And in James 2:24 it says, "You see, a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone." So here's the problem for you and me as we continue to think about this thing that Jude says to contend for the faith. The faith is different than the gospel. It's different than salvation. It is, what is this system, and how do we put these things together? The writer of Hebrews talks about in Hebrews 11:19 that at this point in time that James was talking about, when Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain, that God had promised that it was through Isaac that his descendants would be that his descendants would come through. And so God, when God's asking Abraham to do this, Abram's like, it's not my problem, it's God's problem. And in Hebrews chapter 11:19, it says that Abraham came to the conclusion that God could raise the dead, so that if he does go up and kill his son Isaac, that it's God's problem to bring him back from the dead, not Abraham's problem for killing his son Isaac. We'll talk in an episode. It may be way down the idea of why did Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis move to this place called Bethel and Luz, because there's a connection with this whole place and the idea of resurrection. And I really have come to the idea and convinced that everything Abraham did was something that he was continuing living out this idea of resurrection. And so when we consider the faith, while the gospel is that Jesus Christ died and rose again, he is the fulfillment of the promise of resurrection, that somehow everything Abraham did was living that out. But here's our problem, as we're going to start wrapping this episode up, is that is faith more than just a belief system? This whole idea that we're trying to wrestle through is, what is this thing called the faith? And here's what happens that I see in my life and in lives of churches and people around me, because we're really wrestling through this. We live in a culture that is either belief and no deeds, or we have deeds and no belief. Especially in our younger generation, if you've ever heard the term SJW, or social justice warriors, they are all about deeds. They are all about trying to meet the needs, the physical needs of those who are having difficulties. But the problem is that we in the church have reduced this idea that, oh, well, if you have problems, then just go get a job because you're lazy. And what we've done is that we have done just the opposite. Exactly what James here says is that we don't take care of their needs. And the other thing is that there's somebody out there who is, but they're taking care of their needs outside of a faith construct. And so what happens then is that the church, because we have misunderstood or misapplied this link between faith and works, is that we don't have deeds. And I believe we don't have deeds honestly because we really have no idea what we believe. We really have no idea what the faith is. And so when I say early on in the first episode that what is this thing called the faith, and then we talk about Genesis 15 verses 5 and 6, that when Abram believed the Lord, it was credited to him as righteousness. This thing is something that Paul talks about. This thing is confirmed by James here in James chapter 2. And as we come back now to Jude, verse 3, he says, I felt compelled to write and urge you to contend for the faith. And so this idea of the faith is, how do we link what we believe and what we do together? Is that the next episode we're going to take a look at what is this concept of the faith. And again, we're going to use those 6 things that we talked about in that very first episode. Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 15, 5 and 6, that Abram believed the Lord, is credited him as righteousness. Habakkuk 2, 4, that the righteous will live by faith. John 3, 16. We're going to take a look at Hebrews 11, 6, that without faith it's impossible to please God. And then we're also going to take a look at Revelation 21, that the culmination of creation is that God will be our God and he will be our people. He will move in with us. And so we want to take a look at some of these things and start building this idea of what the faith really is. We'll see you next time, and thanks for tuning in today.